Welcome to the Glucose Never Lies podcast, where science meets real-life experience to empower diabetes management. I'm John Pemberton. I've lived with type 1 diabetes since 2008 and have spent nearly 20 years mastering both the science and art of managing it. Through personal experimentation, published research, and my work as a diabetes specialist dietitian, I've gained deep insights into what truly makes a difference. When my son Jude tested positive for type 1 diabetes antibodies, I realised that all the knowledge in my head was wasted if I couldn't communicate it in a way that was clear, actionable, and easy to come back to. So I built the Glucose Never Lies education programme, a free online resource designed to teach people diabetes management exactly the way I'd want people to understand it if they were looking after my son. After battling a functional motor disorder for many years and recently experiencing a major depressive episode, I was eventually pulled out of that hole by my friends, family, and professionals who helped me get back to being me. That experience taught me the power of giving, and this podcast is my way of giving back. My co-host Louise is a highly experienced diabetes nurse with over 20 years in the field. She brings a wealth of knowledge, and her superpower is making complex diabetes science accessible and practical for everyday life. She is the best diabetes nurse I have ever worked with, and there have been some good ones. Most importantly, she keeps me in check and keeps the podcast on point. So, if you're living with diabetes or supporting someone who is, we want to make things easier, clearer, and importantly, more enjoyable. We hope you enjoy the content. If you do, please share it with those who may like it too. As a disclaimer, the information shared on the Glucose Never Lies podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. While we discuss strategies and insights for diabetes management, this podcast is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Always consult your healthcare team before making any changes to your diabetes plan. That done with, let's get into the content. Welcome to this podcast on activity snacking to improve time in range. Now, I'm going to do this as a solo podcast because I'm presenting at the ATTD in March coming up. So essentially, this is a bit of a practice for me to go through what I'm going to be presenting, but hopefully going to be providing to you the latest evidence on using activity to improve time in range. Something which is not necessarily taught at the moment, but there's a lot of information coming through on the value of, again, using activity to supercharge insulin. So I can kind of pass you back and you can have a look at the principles blog to go into that into a bit more detail. This is going to be looking at the evidence behind it. How can you apply it to your life to maximize time in range without having to give extra insulin and get frustrated when your glucose level goes high between meals and you want to bring it down and insulin just doesn't do the job. So what we're going to walk through is, first of all, talk about activity and the recommendations, really how current therapies, what level of time in ranges they'll get in, and then really how we can use activity to optimize time in range, essentially, by this idea of activity snacking. So depending on your age, if you're a person, an adult, ideally you should be doing at least 30 minutes of moderate intensity activity a day, plus twice a week doing something which stresses your body and makes it stronger. If you're a young person, that should be an hour a day with 2 to 3 sessions that push the body, and again, limiting sitting down time as much as possible. Now, we all know that's almost impossible in today's environment. Everyone's got a car, everything's kind of like electronics, everything is pushed towards us being as lazy as we possibly can. So I guess what we try to have to do is work out things that we can do that we can just incrementally increase our activity. And when you start to see some of the benefits it can have on your glucose control, and because you'll have a continuous glucose monitor, when you start getting that positive feedback of improved time in range, it's just something that can spur you on. So some of the barriers, obviously time, your current health, access to facilities, safety, and when you've got type 1 diabetes, you've obviously got the fear of hypoglycemia to throw in, because everyone's always taught, exercise and activity, that's going to drop your glucose level. You have to be careful, sound the alarms. I'm here to suggest that for exercise, yes, anything that's kind of half an hour and intense. But when we're talking about general activity and stuff that will optimize your time in range, it's actually very low risk of hypoglycemia, which I'll discuss. So really try and separate this in your mind. Movement and activity equals time in range. Exercise equals hypoglycemia risk. Two very different beasts and need looking at very differently. So at the moment, people with type 1 diabetes are no different to people without type 1 diabetes. Less than half of the people meet the recommendations because the environment is set up to not be active. So you have to go out of your way to be active. If we took ourselves back 100 years when maybe we were working more on the farms, etc., we didn't have to worry about this. It was just natural on a daily basis. But when you've got to think about it, it then becomes harder. So we have to think about ways we can put activity into our daily life that will make it easier. Now, we know the sort of international recommendations are that we should be aiming for 70% time in range between 3.9 and 10, or 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter, with no more than 4% less than 3.9 millimoles per litre, or less than 70. So the reality is, if you're on injections or pump therapy with CGM, only about a quarter of the people actually meet those criteria because it's bloody hard. Even people on automated insulin delivery systems, in the real world, only about 45% of people meet those criteria. So even with the best technologies that we have in the world, less than half the people get those target levels. And that's because, unfortunately, insulin is just too slow to respond to higher glucose levels. Yes, it does work, but it doesn't work fast enough. And we're at a bit of a sticking point with the insulins because although we've now got ultra-rapid insulins, they're still peak after 60 to 90 minutes and take 3 to 4 hours to finish. Well, if you want to bring your glucose level down, who wants to wait 3 hours? That takes forever. So is there something different we can use and utilize to optimize that time in range and supercharge that insulin that's already in there? So on the principles blog, you will have heard that one of the main problems for the glucose level going high after eating is because the insulin that people with type 1 diabetes give goes into the subcutaneous tissue, into the outside blood, and not into the portal vein that sits between the intestine and the liver, which means that most of the glucose that you eat goes through the liver straight out into the bloodstream. What we'd really want is lots of insulin in the portal vein so it actually captures most of the glucose in the liver, but it doesn't happen. So how do we sort of come over that? And also, as I mentioned before, because we give insulin to the subcutaneous tissue, the blood flow is the rate limiting factor to how quickly it gets absorbed. So if you're sat on your backside, the blood flow to your skin is slow, therefore the insulin absorption is slow. Compare that to the pancreas that's got millions of little beta cells dropping insulin out left, right and centre. No wonder it's easier for people without diabetes to keep control of their glucose levels after eating. And then finally, as I described on the principles blog, the kidneys are mainly responsible for people with type 1 diabetes for deactivating insulin or getting rid of it. So if you're sat on your backside and you're not moving much, there's a lot of blood flow to the kidneys. A lot of that insulin gets degraded before it has a chance to do its job. So there's a lot of things against you if you've got type 1 diabetes in terms of keeping control of after meal highs. Not only to mention that, you're supposed to give your insulin 15 minutes before. I really struggle with that at lunchtime. It's almost impossible. And then in the breakfast time and the evening time, it is a lot more possible, but it is such a challenge. But that's another thing when you've got type 1 diabetes that you're supposed to do. And another thing you're supposed to do is count carbohydrate to the gram, which again, in an ideal world is what you'll do, but sometimes isn't necessarily possible. So again, there are lots of things. And then finally, who doesn't love white bread? Who doesn't love white rice? Who doesn't love bananas? They taste great, but they get absorbed extremely quickly, high glycemic index foods. And if they're eaten on their own without a balanced meal, again, you're going to shoot up after eating, even if you give your insulin on time and 15 minutes ahead. So if you've got type 1 diabetes, you've got a lot of things that make the glucose level very tricky to manage after eating. And giving insulin, which peaks after 60 to 90 minutes and takes 3 to 4 hours to finish its job, often doesn't match how these foods get absorbed and how your glucose level behaves. So is there something else that can help us? Well, this is where activity comes in. So you've got 3 main ways that being active is going to help this situation. The first one is when you move, you pump the blood around your outside of your body so your insulin gets absorbed faster from your skin. More gets delivered to your muscles and less to your kidneys, so more of that insulin that you've given becomes pound for pound stronger. And then also, when you're active, you get non-insulin mediated glucose uptake. So when you start to move, your cells recognize they need more glucose. They send a straw up from the center of the cell to the surface of the cell and starts to suck glucose in without the need for insulin. So you can see very quickly there, you've now got a very powerful tool to overcome the fact that your insulin's not in the portal vein, that the absorption's slow. Being active is something that could really make a difference in managing your after meal highs. So what does the evidence say? There's some really, really nice work back in 2012, which looked at 10 people with type 1 diabetes and 10 people without type 1 diabetes. And what they got them to do is come into the lab and have breakfast, lunch, and evening meal. On one day, they just sat on their backside like a normal day's working. And then on the second day, they got them to walk around every half an hour, just 30 minutes, literally pottering about. Nothing crazy, just a little potter about. And what they found is both for the people with and without type 1 diabetes, their after-meal glucose levels were reduced massively. And this is a really important point, because when we teach people where I work about it's important for people with diabetes to be active after eating, we also say it's a family thing. Just because this person can see it on their continuous glucose monitor doesn't mean that it's not happening in the rest of the family. You just don't see it. So it's not a type 1 diabetes thing, it's an everybody thing. And it's important as a family that everyone sort of gets on board with that. And there's also clear evidence from Lauren Turner in Canada, who works with Mike Riddell. They've done some nice work to show that 20 minutes of walking before a meal actually sensitizes the body to insulin, so that then the post-meal glucose rises don't go as high. So again, if you can't do it after you've eaten, 20 minutes walking before you're eating, again, will be a fantastic thing. And I actually took part in that study. It was done remotely. So Lauren had me walking around. I had this 20-minute lap around my block. I had to do it 20 minutes before or 20 minutes after and put in the details. But it's a nice piece of research, and I'll link to that in the show notes. And then there's been a whole host of big pushes for, okay, is 20 minutes? Well, no one wants to do 20 minutes. What about 3 minutes? And Matthew Campbell's team in Sunderland, they actually looked at, they're bringing people into the lab, and they got them again to have their 3 meals on a daily basis. And on one day, they just again sat on their backside. But on the next time, these people with type 1 diabetes did 3 minutes of walking every half an hour, 3 every 30. And they actually found over the 24-hour period, they had a 14% improvement in time in range. So if you were 54%, that takes you to 70% by doing 3 minutes every 30. I mean, that's a fairly low bar. That's getting up, going for a walk around, going for a brew, having a wee, doing something that actually just gets your body moving, gets that blood pumping round, gets that insulin working much more effectively. And that's also been reproduced with doing resistance exercise. So people doing, for example, squats and press-ups at their desk for 3 minutes. I mean, I'm not sure how realistic that is, although I've been known to do that a couple of times. I think the walking is a little bit more realistic, but 3 every 30 is a simple strategy that anyone can use. And the important thing about all of these is they didn't increase the risk of hypoglycemia. So when I said at the beginning, separate in your mind, activity equals time in range, exercise equals hypoglycemia risk, this is exactly what I mean. You can either have 3 every 30, or you can do 20 minutes walking before or 20 minutes walking after. All of those will get a flatter glucose profile, a lot more time in range with virtually no risk of hypoglycemia. So that is kind of like the beginning part. Now, what I'm really interested in, I've been involved in research quite a bit recently, is, well, what happens if you're already high? Because obviously these things are great in theory. Yes, do your 20 minutes before, 20 minutes after. But in reality, we've all got lives where we don't want to be militant about managing these glucose levels like that. But then if you hit a level of 10 or above, what can you do to improve the glucose level? So yes, you could give a correction insulin, but we all know that takes ages, and I'm sure there's loads of people out there who have been guilty, as I have. You see a high glucose level, you put one correction in, you wait 20 minutes, nothing's happening, so you put another in, nothing happens in another 20 minutes, and then you fire a third one in, and the next thing, in an hour and a half's time, it comes flying down, you're sticking a load more glucose and you back up again, and that is known as the glucose roller coaster. So if you want to get off that glucose roller coaster, what other option have you got? Well, this is where activity comes in. And this was I first identified this by a paper that was by Mike Riddell and colleagues back in 2019. And they took 4 studies together of 120 kids. And in all of these 4 studies, they had their full meal and full insulin. And then 2 to 4 hours later, they did 45 minutes of either walking or cycling. And they saw what happened to their glucose levels. And quite rightly in this research, what they said is that almost half of the people went low. Therefore, what we need to do when we're doing activity and exercise is take some action. You need to either reduce the insulin or give more carbs. Of course you do. So I looked at that and thought, obviously that makes sense. But then if you looked at the graph closely, what you can see is those people who started that activity 2 to 4 hours after eating with full insulin on board, over 30% of them were above 10. Which means that even the best control conditions in the lab, 30% of the people still end up with a level above 10, when you do everything right. And when you look at those people specifically who started above 10, who did the 45 minutes, well, virtually all of them came back below 10 with less than 10% of them being low. So 45 minutes was enough to bring everybody back down into target without you causing to go low. And if you do some of the maths for how long, what they dropped, so on average they dropped about 6 millimoles per litre or 110 milligrams per decilitre in 45 minutes. If you break that down into 15-minute slots, that's 15 minutes drops the glucose level by 2 millimoles per litre, or 15 minutes drops the glucose level by 40. So that is really simple to do your 2 times tables. If you're 12, 15 minutes will take you to 10. If you're 14, 15 minutes will take you to 10. So again, you can use a simple 2 times table, thinking that 15 minutes for 2, or if you like your 40 times table, if you milligrams per decilitre, and you can work out when you're high in between meals. This gets you down in 15 or 20 or 30 minutes. That's very different to a correction dose for insulin, which can take up to 2 hours, 3 hours, and you sat there pissed off about it. This can get you down in 15 to 20 minutes. So I noticed this and then started using this myself. I would be at home, and if I went high after eating, I'd be like, okay, I want to give this a go, and I go for a walk for 15 minutes. And to be honest, it blew me away of how effective it was at just bringing my glucose level back down, and I wasn't annoyed. And I do that so regularly now. I'm to be seen around Birmingham city centre after lunch when I've gone, say, to maybe 10, 15 minutes around the block, bang, I'm back into target. Then I can just get on with what I'm doing rather than being pissed off about being high. So 15 by 2 is a strategy that I picked up from this paper. And actually, that's what we teach where I work at the Children's Hospital. We teach it from the very beginning that if you're high between meals, 15 minutes will drop you by 2. And just to put it out there, not everyone loves this strategy. About 30% of the people who we look after love it. 30% use it somewhat. 30% roll their eyes and go, hell no, I'm not going to use that. And that's fine. It's just a tool that may be useful for you. And you might start to think, as I did, well, if I'm above 10 and I did 15 by 2 to get time in range, what about time in tight range? What about time below 7.8 millimoles per litre? What about if I'm sort of like between 8 and 10, could I use it then? So we developed an algorithm, which is in the show notes, which basically says if you're between 8 and 10 and a steady arrow or going up, you can use anywhere between 5 and 15 minutes to bring your time in tight range back in target. So if you're someone who, like me, loves to get on the nerdy side of things and wants a really high time in tight range, you can use it in that 8 to 10 bracket and use more like 5 to 15 minutes to bring you back down into that time in tight range. So you can check those out in the show notes. And you might say, well, 120 people, that's not too many. And you're telling me about you, that's an N equals 1. Well, I'm not really convinced. Well, I totally understand that. And that's when I looked at some research that came out over in America from what's called the Type 1 DEXI study. And this is where they took over 500 adults and about 150 adolescents. And they got the adults to wear a CGM and record all their activity events, and they took all the downloads from their pumps and everything, and they got them to do 6 20-minute sessions over 30 days, but also to track when they were just doing daily activities like gardening, walking, etc. And what they wanted to check out was what happens with activity and exercise in the real world with the glucose levels. And they did the same with the 12 to 18-year-olds, but they only followed them for 10 days, and they didn't give them specific exercise sessions. They just said, we'll follow you, just log when you're doing your activity. So there's been loads of publications on this, and it shows some really good stuff. But I thought this is the perfect data set to look at those people who had insulin. They were above 10 before they started. What happened to their glucose levels in the real world doing all these various different types of activities? Did they come back down into target at a rate of about 15 by 2? So Mike Riddell, who's kind of like one of the godfathers of type 1 diabetes and exercise research, who I'd met a couple of times, I just basically stalked him for 3 months. And I was like, right, this is the data set to answer this question. Come on, let's sort it out. And he was like, and the kind of first few emails was probably like, who is this guy? But then I think when he realized I wasn't going away, it would be easier just to do it than to kind of like keep fobbing me off. So I basically chased him down for 3 months. And he was like, right, if you're prepared to do the right and do the work, I'll get the team to see whether we can look at it. And we made it happen. So we published a paper, which you'll be able to see. But essentially what we did is we got all the activity events over 1,900 events overall, 1,600 by adults, 300 by adolescents, where they did between 10 to 60 minutes of activity. Their starting glucose level was above 10 or 180 milligrams per decilitre. They didn't have anything during the activity. And what we wanted to see was what happened to their glucose level at the end of activity and up to the hour afterwards. And in different conditions, when they had insulin on board, when they didn't have insulin on board, depending on what their rate of change arrow was going at. And very simply, what we showed is roughly, again, 15 minutes drops the glucose level by 2 millimoles per litre or 40 milligrams per decilitre, and it's very consistent. The more you do, the more you drop in terms of time. So again, the big distinction was that it showed if you do this with insulin on board, i.e. you've had insulin in the last 4 hours, it works at about 15 minutes drops the glucose by 2, 15 minutes drops the glucose by 40 milligrams per decilitre. But if you do it with no insulin on board, you haven't given a bolus in the last 4 hours, then it's basically not effective at all. So you don't want to use this strategy first thing in the morning, or if you haven't had insulin from a meal or a correction in the last 4 hours. So that's really important. And the other thing is also, if you've got a trend arrow that's already going down, you only need half of the time. So 7 or 8 minutes will drop you by 2, for example. If you've got an arrow trending up, you'll probably need quite a bit more, double the amount, which kind of makes sense. So that was nice. And the important thing about this was it didn't matter whether you were on pumps, injections, or automated insulin delivery systems, it worked equally well. It worked equally well whether you're an adult or a young person, and it didn't matter what type of activity. So it could be walking, it could be resistance training, it could be interval training, it could be gardening, it could even be fast-paced walking at shopping. Anything like that gets the body moving and the blood pumping works at this roughly 15 minutes drops the level by 2 or by 40 when you're above 10 at the beginning. So those are kind of like the key takeaways. That's over 1,900 events. But then the question comes, as you might be thinking, well, you looked at all those events, those 1,900 events, and it looks like it drops. But what would have happened if they would have done nothing? You haven't got a control for those 1,900 events because those 1,900 events may have just dropped on their own. So all you're measuring is actually what would have happened normally. And that is a great question. So if you were thinking about that, you are definitely a scientist. So we needed to answer that question. So I got in contact with Kat Russon from Exeter, and she's a computer wizard, data scientist, and just all around good human being, and said, look, she's got this sort of machine learning approach, and she could actually go into the data and for each individual 1,900 events, find 1,900 events from the same person, obviously not the same person, but matching them, of the same period where the insulin on board was the same, the rate of change was the same, all of them, being above 10 was the same, etc., etc. So she what we call like a matched pair analysis to see when you match them, if they would have done nothing, what happened? If they would have done the activity, what happened? And we focused specifically on activity events of 10 to 30 minutes. And basically what it showed was 15 minutes drops the glucose level by 2 if you do the activity. If you don't do the activity, in 15 minutes, you'll drop by about 0.4. So there is a massive difference for actually doing it. And again, we've just shown clearly that insulin on board is the key factor. So it's most important to do this when you have insulin on board in the last 4 hours. A bolus has been given in the last 4 hours. Again, if you haven't, it doesn't work. So essentially now we've got kind of like a raft of evidence to show the benefits of being active. So I'm going to summarize all this for you. So the first thing is, that'll be my high glucose alarm, which is going to signify I'm going to have to go for a walk after this, is that activity snacking really works. So think of it in this way. Just on a day-to-day basis, 3 every 30. 3 minutes will drop the glucose, 3 minutes every 30 will keep the glucose level in range, improve your time in range. If you can do a walk before, 20 minutes will sensitize the body to insulin for after. If you can, just being active after eating will keep you in range. But if you do go high, above 10 or above 8 or above 12, wherever your high threshold is, 15 minutes drops the glucose level by 2 millimoles per litre or 14 milligrams per decilitre. So again, simple strategies of how activity supercharges the insulin will make a huge impact on your overall time in range if you use it. Obviously, if you don't use it, it's not going to be effective at all. So hopefully this podcast, along with the show notes, which shows the diagrams for all these things, will give you, the person as a type 1 diabetes, permission to be active, but obviously check with your healthcare professional team first. And if you're a person who looks after people with type 1 diabetes, this should be taught as First line, we teach it to all our people who we see on diagnosis, repeated at CGM education, repeated at automated insulin delivery systems. And again, 30% of people will use this regularly, 30% will use it somewhat, and 30% will not use it at all. But it's a tool to be used by the person who wants to use it. So some final caveats: if your glucose levels above 14 or 250, check your ketones. If the ketones are there, don't do it, you'll just need insulin. If the ketones are not there and you're above 14, you'll probably need a half correction along with some activity. Activity alone is not going to do the job. And most importantly, it needs to be done at the discretion of the person with diabetes. So that is to say, do not be frog marching kids around the playground to say your glucose level is high, you've got to do some activity, you've got to bring that glucose level down. It's to be used as a strategy to enhance the person's life, not to make it like is something that you're shouting at someone and you've got diabetes, so you've got to do activity. So it's to be used at their discretion. But it's the family thing. Activity is great for everyone's glucose levels. It's just that people with type 1 diabetes see it more because they have a continuous glucose monitor. So I hope that has helped. This is something I'm passionate about. It's probably something that I would love it to be taught as first principles in diabetes management, and actually first principles for healthy living for everyone. But because we have type 1 diabetes, we get to see it on our CGM. So it's a lot more positive feedback for us on how to improve things. So I hope you found that helpful and useful. And yeah, the next set of series is going to be on CGM, the CGM deep dive about what is accuracy, how to measure it, which systems are the most accurate at the moment, what are all the bells and whistles that you can use. So hopefully that'll be helpful for people who are thinking about a CGM, maybe want to change their CGM, know how to select things appropriately. So we'll see you at the next session.